Hi, my name is Michael Rossoff, and I'm speaking to you from Asheville, North Carolina, in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And it's a pleasure to be here and participate in this forum. I truly appreciate everything that Ganat has done over the past, I think, year and a half or 2 years now. And it's really having a big and important impact in the macrobiotic world. Today, my topic is macrobiotics vegan? And it is something that I've been thinking about, not just recently, but in different forms and fashions over the years. And so I want to look at both the history of macrobiotics and the trends that have occurred and the different influences that are happening within macrobiotics, especially over the past 2 decades. But right now, I want to start with the past, because macrobiotics is really coming from a lot of history, and that history is, in a simple statement, it has been very broad about food, and in its teachings and in its practice, and with certain clear delineations and guidelines. But if we start looking back in the past, and I have some books here that I'm gonna quote from, we're gonna see that macrobiotics in its earliest years, going back to the 60s and 70s, clearly had fish and or other animal foods included in some of the early major cookbooks. And when I say major, I mean who were the cooks who wrote these cookbooks. They were not secondary people outside of macrobiotics kind of coming in. They were principal people. Clearly, one of the most principal people is Lima Osawa. Of course, she is George Osawa's husband and traveled with him throughout the world, teaching macrobiotics, teaching cooking, experiencing many different cultures, along with George, and listened to numerous, if not all, of his lectures, and really has had a deep understanding of macrobiotics. So this is her only English language cookbook. It's called The Art of Just Cooking. It's a humble name, but with a very excellent material in it, still to this day. Now, so I want to start by quoting her. And it's going to be a minute or two of quotes, because I think what she says then in 1974 is when this book was published. What she has said in this book resonates to this day. And she starts out in her introduction saying, practical macrobiotics begins with a studied appreciation of foods. Our philosophy first divides the available variety into 2 categories of animal yang and vegetable yin. It is a law of ecology that all animal life depends for its existence upon the vegetable kingdom. For vegetal forms transmute nature's basic chemicals into digestible foods. A food chain, a hierarchy of eater and eaten, dictates that large fish feed upon small ones, while the latter are nourished by sea and river plants. The carnivorous creatures of the world devour the herbivorous ones. We humans, too, evolutionarily the most recent to the food chain, depend either directly or indirectly upon plant life for our nourishment. The macrobiotic diet, however, is not a strict vegetarian regime. We do not believe that if a man or woman eats vegetables exclusively, he or she of necessity achieve health or vitality and live in harmony with the environment, or that, for that matter, that every man must restrict himself to the vegetal realm if he wants to realize his nature. The natural order in our surroundings is both more precise and more flexible. The shape and relative number of our teeth, the gateway of food into the body, tells us more about the order of human nutrition. From here, she goes on to explain more about the teeth and that there are the canine teeth and that those represent our evolutionary history of having eaten meat, and that our digestive tract is still designed to be able to handle animal foods. Then she goes on and adds, room is left, however, on the plate, as in the mouth, for proportionately small quantities of animal foods, if necessary or desirable. The animal foods we recommend are the lower forms of life, or those that have been least domesticated or processed by modern man. We do advise that a few animal foods as possible be part of one's daily fare. Later on in the introduction, she adds, to follow the macrobiotic diet properly, each of us must come to know himself and understand the dynamics of food to discover how best to satisfy his own particular requirements. People's needs differ according to their physical constitution, nutritional background, their age and daily activities, their geographic location, and the seasonal changes in the environment. You can be a vegetarian and derive all the vitamins, minerals, etc., from a well-balanced diet of grains, fresh vegetables, fruits, and nuts. But animal foods and dairy products, interestingly, she adds, can also find a place in a macrobiotic meal if we prepare them properly and combine them harmoniously with other elements included in our menu. We are free to eat whatever we wish. Nothing is forbidden but ignorance and carelessness. I think her introduction there is very powerful and important for everyone in macrobiotics. And I'll further exemplify by further quotes and readings and further discussion. But just to give you an idea of what some of the recipes she had in her cookbook, has in this cookbook, that include animal foods. It's all fish or shellfish and eggs. She has red snapper tempura, salmon croquettes, seafood dumplings, koi kaku, which is carp soup, shrimp and eggs, egg tofu. Those are some examples from her cookbook. Another important person in macrobiotics as a longtime teacher is Cornelia Ihara. She, along with Herman Ihara, ran the Vega Center in California and helped start Chico-san in California and have an important contributions to macrobiotics, both Herman and Cornelia, with their writings and their teachings. In this cookbook, calendar cookbook from 1979, she has, I'm just going to be very brief because she doesn't really talk about the animal foods. She just includes recipes with them, such as baked fresh tofu, fried oysters, cold salmon with gravy, tofu egg clear soup with watercress, egg drop soup. But she even had other animal foods like quail, wild pigeon, shish kebab, fried chicken, roast turkey with stuffing. And this was 1979. She also had an earlier book in 1984, which was revised from a 1964 book called The First Macrobiotic Cookbook. And there she had mussels, shrimp tempura, oysters and clams, scallops, sesame chicken, duck clear soup, just to give you some ideas of other animal foods that were being represented in macrobiotic literature early on. And that is part of our history. Another important representative of cooking appreciation in macrobiotics is Michelle Abasera. If you have not heard of Michelle Abasera, I strongly recommend you look at some of his books. He wrote 3 or 4 cookbooks and contributed to other important books, Healing Ourselves, a book on clay for healing, just other realms. He is a Jewish Rebbe, and he's a very well known in the Jewish community. In this book, Zen Macrobiotics, which originally, this is a reproduction, a reissuing of it when it came out originally as a paperback in 1968. And in this book, a short quote, you always probably know that Zen monks were vegetarians. Zen macrobiotics is based on deep respect for this vegetarianism and allows it to a very considerable extent, but leaves room for fish and fowl as secondary foods. Unlike the traditional vegetarians, Zen Macrobiotics considers fish, when part of a meal in which rice or other grains are primary, vegetables and fish secondary, a healthful food. Fowl is less healthful, but if organically fed, will do no harm. He was a student of George Osawa, and he met Osawa in France, in Paris, and was inspired by Osawa to improve his own condition. And then Michelle Abasera came to New York and taught many, many years in New York and traveled to Europe and elsewhere across the US. He had such things as lobster Cantonese, fresh herring in wine sauce, stuffed mackerel. And he wrote another book called Cooking with Care and Purpose, right over here. And this book, I just have one sentence quote from this book, which was 1978. Fish is a healthy food for vegetarians who refuse to eat meat. It gives stamina to the organism. For Jews, it's a holy food that is served on Friday nights and Saturdays. And he had fish pancakes, salmon casserole, and some other foods. Now, I would like to bring up one more cookbook, and then I'll continue on with other discussions. And this cookbook is Anne-Marie Colvin. I hope everyone's seen some of her books, heard of her, and maybe even knew her. Anne-Marie was an extraordinary person and started the Natural Gourmet Cooking School in New York, and was a very inspiring teacher and cook, and has helped create many restaurants in America based on her studied cooking with her cooking school and have incorporated her approaches to natural foods cooking. So she's had an influence in many realms, is my point. And I want to quote from her a few paragraphs. This book is 1989, so we're kind of progressing through time here and seeing what macrobiotic cooking teachers are saying. As I developed my approach, my book learning became rounded out by my real life experience. I found, for example, that not only do sick meat eaters get healthier when they eat vegetarian, but weak vegetarians often become stronger when they reincorporate fish or fowl in their diet. In 1979, I wrote a cookbook called The Book of Whole Foods. The book is meatless and wholly dairy and sugar-free, but does contain several fish and egg recipes. Curiously enough, I received completely opposite comments about the book. Strict adherents of macrobiotics considered it too wide, while mainstream nutritionists think it is too restricted. It is possible to be a healthy vegetarian, provided you eat whole grains and bean combinations daily and a variety of vegetables of all colors. It is imperative that you avoid white table sugar and the foods containing it. It is not, however, essential that you be a vegetarian. If you label yourself as such, deviations from your dietary standards, which are sometimes unavoidable, will cause you anguish and guilt. It is much more sensible to choose to eat foods that keep you well, that keep you feeling healthy, whatever those may be. Many people today are finding that a largely natural foods diet, sugar and dairy free, with accents of fish, fowl, or perhaps an occasional egg, keep them in excellent health. Concerning fish recipes, she says, committed vegetarians can skip this chapter. However, most people have some trouble absorbing the protein from vegetable foods efficiently. Therefore, a tasty fish dish several times a week is a must for good health and stamina. And she had numerous fish dishes, such as rolled flounder fillet with lemon dill sauce, poached salmon fillet with mock hollandaise sauce, baked whitefish with scallions, and others. So I offer these books as a representative of a history of macrobiotic teaching of cooking by well-known and important teachers over many decades. Granted, there are many other macrobiotic wonderful cookbooks that have been written and produced, and I'm not missing over those. I've just chosen these as a representative that I think reflect a respect and an incorporation of some animal food within the scope of macrobiotics. Now, one of the, I would call it side notes of a challenge to thinking that fish should be incorporated into macrobiotics is that it has been said that Japanese basically outlawed animal food eating. And that is in part true. Emperor Tenmu, who was in 1675 AD, became a Buddhist and decreed that there will be no meat eating. Now, that sounds very convincing, and that all the Japanese would say aso, aso, and obey. But it isn't, the history is not that simple. And it's not now the time for me to explore that much. I will just say, here's an article that I will be glad to post on my website. And it's an article thanks to Greg Johnson, who sent this to me. It's called Removal of the Ban on Meat, the Meat Eaters' Culture of Japan at the Beginning of Westernization. It's quite a long article, but the main point is, and I'm quoting from this article, that in April of the year 765 AD, the Emperor Tenmu prohibited the killing and the eating of meat throughout Japan. The ban prohibited the eating of beef, horse, dog, monkey, chicken, during the busy farming period between April and September. And it never referred to fish, firstly. And during the many decades and centuries since then, there have been different revisions of this ban that have come along by different emperors and people. But I'll let you all read this for those who would be interested. Now, next I want to discuss that macrobiotics has, from day one when I went to Boston in 1969, always had fish as an accepted part of our macrobiotic approach. As strict as it was in so many ways, there was fish once a week in the study house. It wasn't to go out and binge and eat it out. It was in the study house. And why was fish, what was the explanation then? And still, in my opinion, to today, why fish is the most accepted or acceptable of animal foods. And one reason is that fish comes from the water world, and we are of the land world, and so are other animals and mammals particularly. And therefore, fish are much more distant from us. They're the more primitive water world and evolutionarily very far from us. And that made it more appropriate. Furthermore, fish were seen and can be seen as considerably less yang than animal meats, whether that is beef and pork and other meats. So being less yang meant also that therefore it would create less cravings for extra strong yin. And in that way, you could still maintain a relative balance. To think that it was being done solely to make it more acceptable to the world, I find strange, because macrobiotics saw itself in the 60s and 70s as a very avant-garde and very anti-establishment, and really could have cared less what the rest of the world was saying about its approach, except that it wanted some acceptance as we move into the 70s. Now, I want to tell different personal stories about my experience with macrobiotics and my teachings and encounters with people. So I want to just mention two different things firstly. One is in the early 1990s, there were more and more statements of people leaving macrobiotics. And that meant that I became very curious when others would say, well, they're no longer macrobiotic. To me, that raised the question, what does that mean when someone is no longer macrobiotic, who was happily and seemingly doing fine being macrobiotic? Was it that they started eating some cheese, or they started having some sugar, or they started eating some chicken? Well, whatever, I felt that this represents a misnomer and a mistake. Anyone who really absorbed macrobiotics, where we know means eating whole foods, natural foods, whole grains as our staple and as our basis, then once that's incorporated and learned, then and somebody widens their diet, we should still be able to embrace them and not see it as outside of macrobiotics, as long as they still adhere to the concepts that I'm going to come to later. So I tried to discuss this in public because I felt it represented an arrogance within macrobiotics to say they are not macrobiotic, they are not within our exclusive, narrow definition of macrobiotics. And I'm saying we need, even I'm saying then, we need to expand our definition, not hold it so narrow. And another example brings us to 2011 and 12, when here in Asheville, North Carolina, there were 2 other principal macrobiotic teachers along with myself. So there were 3 of us, and we each were doing our own thing and not really competing, but not in strong rapport. And at a certain point, we said, let's join forces. Let's learn to share together, cooperate, and support each other. And we did that, created a nonprofit called the Asheville Macrobiotic Alliance. And in this grouping, the 2 other main teachers and myself, we would advertise each other's lectures. We would go to their lectures. We would do some referrals to each other. We were definitely very in great camaraderie. And then something happened. The end of 2011, beginning of 2012. One of the other 2 went off on a vacation and came back and had gone onto a special diet called live foods, which is fundamentally raw foods. And she and her husband came back in January and were proclaiming this is the new macrobiotics. And I said to her, I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad you find it helpful and important. And I would consider this an area of macrobiotics, if you like, but not to call it the future of macrobiotics. And I cannot support that publicly. And this caused a big conflict. And ultimately, it broke up the Asheville Macrobiotic Alliance. And I wasn't trying to break it up, but I was trying to stand my ground that macrobiotics cannot be defined in one segment of a dietary approach. Now, it seems to me, and I think most everyone in macrobiotics, the longer you've been in it, the more this will resonate, that macrobiotics has become less popular in the world. And there are the centers that used to be have pretty much dwindled. Only a few remain. And all the power to them. And I'm certainly supportive of all efforts to teach macrobiotics. So what I saw happening in the 90s and 2000s, especially in the 2000s, was to try and tag on to other dietary popular approaches, such as plant-based or vegan. These became easy for macrobiotics to say, hey, folks, we are that too. So why not come into macrobiotics? And I want to just very simply talk about the holistic holiday at sea cruise that has been going on since 2004 by Sandy Pukel. And it's been very, very successful and very popular. He started it in 2004 as a macrobiotic cruise, kind of a vacation cruise in the Caribbean, where they did serve fish the first 2 or 3 years, he tells me. But over the last 15 years, they started promoting their cruise as plant-based or vegan and no longer serve fish. Though they did say the cruise was also macrobiotic, and Sandy really worked very diligently to keep the cuisine and the recipes being vegan, vegetarian, macrobiotic quality cooking. My point is that fish was no longer part of it, and macrobiotics was no longer the key promotional part of it, because macrobiotics had lost its popularity. So what about vegan? And as I said in my write-up to this talk, I am very supportive of people who want to be vegan. That is not my discussion here today. I have had people come to me, and I remember this mother bringing her 16, 17-year-old daughter to me and saying, she insists on being vegan. She can't stand the idea of killing animals. And can you help her eat healthfully? And I said, sure. And I worked with that girl and helped her design a way of eating that could be very healthy for her and not just be random, vegetarian, vegan. And that is kind of the next point I want to make, that I think macrobiotics has a lot to offer vegans and vegetarians, because we really do understand cooking, food selection, preparation, and balance in a way that I think very few other cuisines have fully understood. But to say that that is macrobiotics is where I differ. Now, about 10 years ago here in Asheville, I was the speaker at a potluck, and I was told that a lot of vegans were coming because they were exploring macrobiotics then, and they were belligerent to me, belligerent in their harsh questioning. Oh, so much cooking. Oh, you use salt. Where's all the fruit? And why isn't there more salads? In a way, I find vegetarian, vegans to be very intense on their style of vegan. And I wonder how easy it is to inspire them to be macrobiotic. Certainly, I wasn't able to do it on that brief talk. Oh, so much grains. Oh, why all this oil? And why should you use oil in cooking? And so my observation about vegan vegetarians, longtime ones, is their attraction to it. If we use yin yang, why are they attracted to it? And they're attracted often because of religious, spiritual paths they're on, like Buddhism or having a certain Indian guru. And some have these very young, super young constitutions, and they naturally gravitate towards more yin style of foods and cooking. And then there are those who want to be vegan for ethical or humane reasons. And I can understand and respect all of those. But people who've been, some people, I should say, who've been vegan for decades and decades and decades, I find, start craving a lot of sugar. And whether it's fruits, a lot of sweets, and I have my opinions of why that is so, because of what's lacking in their diet or approach to eating, and trying to get some short-term energy from the sugars and sweets and fruits. But it's not how our body is designed to maintain good health. Now, I think it's important to recognize that just because, and I'm speaking more broadly here, but just because a food or a food style works well for one person, maybe someone has heart problems, and they decide, oh, I learned that being vegan is really going to help them. And they do it and they get better. That's great. And I'm saying vegan style can help many conditions and many people. But that, as teachers, that does not mean we should say that what's good for me is good for everybody else. Everybody is unique and different. And the whole point of macrobiotics is assessing our differences and honoring those differences and finding balance for those differences. So I want to comment about macrobiotic teachers in another light. It's kind of, and I say this about myself as well, there over the decades was a certain unspoken attitude of do as I say, not as I do. For many of the macrobiotic, as a matter of fact, I can't think of any macrobiotic teacher when eating out would ever not choose to have things that they were telling others not to have at all. Whether that was sugar, alcohol, coffee, white flour and potatoes, dairy, or other animal foods. For myself, it was coffee and cigarettes that I did. And I quit cigarettes 28 years ago, but I certainly never promoted cigarette smoking, but I was doing it back then. Now, I want to tell another story, and this is 2015, January 2015. Michio Kushi's funeral was who died in December of 2015. His funeral was in January. He died in 2014, and his funeral was in 2015 in Boston. And I went to it, and many other teachers from around the world came to honor Michio. And we had a meeting afterward, the next day or so. And Jessica Porter raised the question while there was a wide-ranging discussion about the future of macrobiotics. And her question to the group was, why is it that there are so many other successful diets, super popular, millions of followers, whether it's South Beach diet or plant-based diet or keto diet, and macrobiotics is kind of being left behind? And I gave my answer to that group. And my answer is twofold. There is no other dietary approach, such as those that I just mentioned, that has ever promised to diagnose and treat with food. The closest would be Oriental medicine itself, which isn't doing that particularly anyway. So the minute we start saying that that's what is the entryway, is that we're going to diagnose and treat you, we've set ourselves up to be something very different than a popular diet that anyone could easily segue to and learn to embrace and discover better health. It became, and my second point is, a lot of requirements to be in macrobiotics. You've got to learn yin and yang, and obviously you've got to learn cooking. You've got to buy certain new cookware. There's a learning curve, and for a lot of people, that's very demanding. And my approach has been to help open the doorway to let people into macrobiotics, not keep it too strict, too tight. And I know that is now more and more happening, so I'm happy to see that. But we're still stuck with this diagnosing and treating. And I've spoken about this in teacher forums and elsewhere, and written about it, that I think we should either drop that or improve it. I think where it's at is not a good place. And that's another discussion outside of my topic today. My final broad points and important points are that obviously we know macrobiotics distinguish itself from all other dietary disciplines on one core thing, which is the unique principle, an understanding of balance through the unique principles, knowledge of yin yang, and creating harmony and health through our choices. But the core part of the unique principle is a way of thinking, a way of developing our judgment, our discernment, our way of understanding, rather than being swayed by pushes and pulls of opinions, and getting beyond right and wrong or good and bads, and finding our way to greatest clarity and ultimately freedom to choose properly for
Michael,
our life.
you froze for just a minute. Could you repeat that last point?
Okay, I was asked to repeat that. So let me re-say it. Macrobiotics stands on one foundation, and that is the unique principle. And let me even take an extra moment before I go further. When I started macrobiotics in 1969, I met Michio Kushi, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, this is not so good, and you should do macrobiotics." And then he said, "Do it for 1 year, and then decide if this is what you want to do." And that had the most important impact on me. He saw something in me that was looking to challenge or understand it in a different light than just do it. And so it was. And I really was challenging it, trying to understand it better, really learning the yin yang and this unique principle. This is our foundation of macrobiotics, and every teacher in macrobiotics would wholeheartedly agree with me. Then my point is, what is the purpose of it? Is it just so that we can choose to make balance between salt and oil, or choosing foods by yin and yang? Yes, that is part of it. But its ultimate purpose is to develop our discernment, our judgment, our ability to make decisions with clarity. And that is what leads to personal freedom. And that is what I see as the foundation and the main wellspring of what is macrobiotics and what will be macrobiotics. And in that light, I am saying I can see that macrobiotics is the best way to be vegan, but it is itself not the intention of macrobiotics. All foods are medicine, says macrobiotics. And look at what macrobiotics has done. It has embraced yin yang and the 5 transformations or 5 element theory. And within that theory, there are the 5 seasons, the 5 main organs, the 5 vegetables, the 5 grains. And this is a great study. And there are the 5 animals. And that those animals were to help strengthen those organs relate to them. Now, I want to commend over here again, Anne-Marie Colvin. This book, specifically, The Natural Gourmet, is based on the 5 transformations. She has made recipes based on different 5 transformations and for different seasons. And she is the only one I know to really utilize that as a popular cookbook. Now, so I'm saying animal food of one sort or another has been part of macrobiotics, principally fish. And I explain why fish is the most appropriate of the animal foods, then I have recommended animal foods to people in counseling. And why and when? Well, it's when I can see that they are very deficient. It's a funny thing. The stricter you become with macrobiotics, the more tight you may be, and that can feel very yang, but it's a yang rigidity, not a yang flexibility. The yang flexibility would be like a bamboo that can bend but not break. But if we become too narrow in certain approaches to macrobiotics, then people become more feeling they're too yang, but they are really becoming deficient. They do not have the strength, the fortitude, and the excess to support greater wellness. And in Chinese medicine, this would broadly be called blood deficiency. So it's in that light that I recommend people to eat wider. You think eating fish or even some chicken bone broth is yang, but to them it is nourishing and it's relaxing. It's energizing. The idea that some animal fats are bad for people because fat is somehow a bad word is really strange. We all need oils and some fats. And that's a separate further conversation than I think is necessary now. But I'm saying that when I have recommended some animal foods like chicken bone broth or fish, and once or twice I've actually recommended red meat to, and most of these are to women, by the way, for it's women who are much more, have a higher tendency of becoming blood deficient in Oriental medicine viewpoint and in my experience. Sometimes it's because of disease process that people are coming to macrobiotics, they can be very deficient. And sometimes it is overdoing and leading to exhaustion that's making them deficient. So there's other people, men or women, that can become deficient. Regardless, my main point now is that macrobiotics covers a wide spectrum of, we need to see it as covering a wide spectrum of foods that we can be free to choose and experience and learn from, and what works for us individually. And what works for you now may not work for you next year. That's the beauty of our understanding, that we need to always reflect, revise, and change. It is that ability to make that change that is the power that macrobiotics offers us, so that we're not just regimented to one way. And I hope this is helpful. I will end on a strange note, maybe I'm not end, but I know I have a few more minutes. Macrobiotics Today magazine, not that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, republished Cornelia Ihara's Thanksgiving turkey recipe in their Thanksgiving issue. And it created a wave of response, and I find this very interesting, of indignation by some very long-time macrobiotic teachers who I highly respect. And they were indignant that a macrobiotic publication would publish a recipe with chicken, or turkey, I'm sorry, it was turkey recipe of Cornelia Ihara's. And I think we need to be a little more respectful, a little more relaxed about our attitudes. Now, the minute we put up that the environment is so toxic and animals of all sorts, from fish to chickens, and others are absorbing these toxins, then that's a justification for not eating them. We are that may persuade some people or inspire them, but it doesn't mean that these animal foods are not medicinal and cannot have an important power, and that we can still find good choices, healthier choices among those animal foods. And so I'm encouraging everyone to reflect on your needs. This is not necessarily a broad conversation against veganism at all. It's a broad conversation of the width and breadth of macrobiotics and our ability to navigate the foods in a more intuitive, sensible, and appropriate way for ourselves. Our body gives us reactions and teaches us too along the way. Our body works with us. And so it's in that spirit that I am strongly recommending a wider approach. And for those who want to be vegan, I'm with you all the way, as long as it can maintain your health and well-being. And macrobiotics is clearly the best way to do it. So I think I've said enough. And if there are a few questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I encourage any of you who would like to ask to unmute yourself. Also, I'll just say that we might give a few extra minutes if there is some discussion now, and ask Naomi, who will be speaking at the top of the next hour. Maybe we'll wait 5 or 10 minutes if we need to do that. So again, my thanks to you, Michael, and any questions are welcome.
Yeah, can I ask one? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Michael. I admire you. And so I have a couple, I don't know how many I can ask, but briefly on any of them. So one is that I run anemic. I'm working with, can you hear me? Denny Waxman, and addressing my anemia. And, you know, my physician had said to eat red meat. And I was like, well, no, I'm vegan. I can't, but I am macrobiotic, and I've become more flexible with eating fish on occasion. That's one. Two is that Bill Tarr just gave a lecture on the International Macrobiotic, saying rethinking eating fish. I know that he's vegan, so I don't know I don't know if anyone had saw that lecture, because I know they're vegan, him and his wife, Bill Tarr. And another one is the COVID vaccination. Now, you're very pro the COVID vaccination because it could target the actual.
Okay.
Anyway,
let me interrupt you. I understand your questions. I'm really not here to. You're seeing Denny for a counseling for your anemia. Please stay with Denny, and I'm sure he'll guide you well. It's not for me to get into somebody's personal health in this situation. Number two is, as far as Bill Tarr's talk, I'm sure Bill is listening, and and I think that my message is clear. I've responded to Bill's points, and there's so I just going to let that be. I've made my presentation, and as far as your question on COVID vaccines, that is well beyond the scope of my talk here today. I've written articles about it. Please read them in Macrobiotics Today or on my website. I've made some very strong stands on the vaccines and tried to be very informative. And so please read them. Macrobiotics Today will be publishing some more responses and my responses to the responses in their next issue as well.
oh, great.
What is your website?
My website is michaelrossoff.com.
Michael, I just wanted to say it was a beautiful lecture. I have attended many in a 40-year span. I have never heard this lecture. And
Wow.
it makes me feel a little more comfortable because I do have that anxiety, and it's not a healthy thing either. So
That's right.
just a wonderful, wonderful lecture. My question is, and I put it in the chat, is obviously you want to eat good quality fish. And I've heard not to eat farm raised fish. When I go to Whole Foods, they say ours is farm raised, but you always think Whole Foods is a higher quality. What is
Right.
your comment about that?
So the question on farm raised fish is a mixed bag. And of course, free range fish in the wild, like wild salmon caught in Alaska, for example, is one thing. A lot of farm raised, there's different types of farm raising of fish, and that's another bigger discussion that I'm not going to explore fully, except to say a lot of farm raising, like in Nova Scotia and such, are controlling where the fish are, but they're in the sea and they are able to eat more naturally, but they are just able to be easy to catch, easy to handle. So that may not be a fair assessment, but it's a quick assessment of the situation. I think you can feel fairly secure with some Alaskan wild salmon, fish from rivers or streams, and like trout, for instance, that are caught, and some other ocean fish like cod could be a very good choice.
Michael,
Thank
do
you.
you have any thoughts that maybe the reason why fish was part of macrobiotics is that Japan is surrounded in so much by so much ocean, and so for them it was plentiful? I mean, that seems to me a little bit of an obvious possibility.
It's very, very, very true. Your point that fish wasn't accepted in macrobiotics or recommended in macrobiotics as the animal food of choice was because Japanese had all that fish, and they had all that fish during the era of no meat, because fish was always available. And in that sense, Japan was never strictly vegan, but still, my points about fish being more distant from us and being the water world, not land world, I think is relevant and meaningful, and that fish overall are less young than any of the animal, especially mammal meats.
Have you ever thought about running? I've thought about running a study group in where I live, where people would, because I have a lot of macrobiotic books, where they would each take one that appealed to them and go and take it away and come back a month later, and we'd share what affected us or what resonated, because it would get the discussion going. I had a lot of experience on Sandy Pukel's cruises in the bookstore, and I really think that in our culture of wanting quick fixes and everything to be easy. In fact, Vern Verone wrote the Macrobiotics for Dummies books, and as everyone knows, the Dummies books are not for dummies at all. They're very well written by very studied people, but it presents it in a way that people who do not think they want to spend a lot of time reading or studying think they can get a start. I can remember when I was in high school, I laughed because I was in a lot of honor classes, most of which the people were in Mensa. And so I like to say I set the bottom of the curve because I was good enough to get into the class, and then everybody else was way above my pay grade. And I think macrobiotics is way there on top of understanding foods. We do a lot of intellectual pursuits on it, which are great, but it's hard for a lot of people.
Your initial point is a nice one. Groups of people could get together even through Zoom and other ways and take a cookbook and really explore it and share comments and share experiences. I think that's great.
or different
Um,
books.
Pardon?
I
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
it's different books and bring, so that get people
Right.
interested in different books.
yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, I don't want to take extra time then, since those are the questions. I want to thank everybody. It's been a pleasure having this opportunity to speak with you. I'm sure, as one of you said, it's stimulating and revealing a lot more about and giving some further insights into macrobiotics. And I hope everyone will take it in the spirit of the adventure that macrobiotics is, rather than the limitations that some have put on themselves. I wish everyone the greatest health, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Michael.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.